defy the odds.
Knowing when to use slow motion or high-speed frame rates is a tough choice to make as a cinematographer. Any use of slow motion should feel intentional, but not overused. But the biggest question, and something I struggled with for the longest time, is when and why should I use slow motion? I'm gonna go over my thought process as a cinematographer and go over some of the basics so you know when to use high frame rates for your project. When I started my video career, I fell into the trap of shooting everything in slow motion because that was the cinematic way to shoot. Sure, it looked great, but my work lacked variety and, more importantly, intention. I used slow motion as a crutch, and I lacked the confidence because I didn't know what I wanted to be normal speed as well as slowed down in post. And this was a big mistake that I fell into. Once I took a step back and learned why high frame rates are used, and more specifically in commercial work, everything changed. Slow motion is used to dramatize an emotion or action. Understanding the uses of this tool allowed me to be more intentional with my work, and that's when I started using slow motion properly. The project that we're going to be looking at is a commercial piece for on highlighting a product release. I'm going to go over my thought process as well as all my camera settings so you can apply this knowledge when shooting high frame rates in your project. The first set of shots that we're going to be looking at is the scene that we shot on the track. And this was a very difficult one to visualize as well as execute because there was a lot of things that were going to be happening in post. Obviously, we don't have an ideal location where you have a track that goes into nothingness. So we had to make that on our own. And the main thing that I want to start off before we even dive into the camera settings here is understanding what we are telling in the story. Context is everything, especially when you're trying to execute on a director's vision as a cinematographer. And I always like to ask myself, as well as the director and anybody who I'm working with, about context and, more importantly, just understanding what I'm supposed to be shooting, what this is supposed to feel like. In this scene, this is the spine of the entire piece. We cut to it multiple times and cut to it in multiple shots of her getting to this end goal, which is this door, which can be represented by the finish line and basically the end of her journey. And that's what she's trying to get to. And in this is supposed to feel very dramatic, very emphasized. And to do this, we shot this on a variety of cameras that can shoot in high-speed frame rates. And this was more importantly on the FX3 as well as the Ember S5K. And this was my first time shooting in super high frame rates, especially when it comes to like a narrative commercial when you're trying to tell a story and working in an environment that you need a lot of light, but you don't necessarily have access to a lot of light. This is the first shot that we're going to be looking at, and this was shot on the Ember S5K. So this is a Super 35 camera, and the lenses that we're shooting this project on were the Zeiss Super Speeds Mark III. And these lenses are very vintage, and a lot of DPs, a lot of cinematographers and directors love to use these lenses just for the look that you get out of them, and I absolutely love them. And for this scene, we're shooting on the 18mm, and these are Super 35 lenses, and I was shooting on a t-stop of 1.3. Usually I don't like to shoot at a wide open t-stop like this, especially when a shot like this when you want multiple planes in focus. This was just because of the nature of what we're shooting. I needed as much light coming into the camera as possible. So because we're shooting on this on a Super 35 camera on 18mm, as well as shooting at 300 frames per second, and this is a cinema camera, so my shutter angle was set at 180 degrees. So this is the standard when it comes to shooting really anything slow motion or anything with you want natural motion blur in. So at this point, I need a lot of light to execute on this, and that's exactly what we had to do. And speaking of lights, I'm gonna draw a little lighting diagram here of kind of the doorway that we're running to, and then our talent running this way, and then my camera is over here. We had in this doorway, which we built ourselves, and then in front of that doorway, we just had an artificial silk. So this is just an art silk, and this is just draped over and pinned to the side with just a pony clamps, and just we cleaned it up as much as possible. So this is providing, I believe, one stop of diffusion. We just wanted to make this look like a white door, and it's just a door of light. So that's what we did there. And then this frame was just built of 2x4s, and then we painted them black so we wouldn't get any artifacts or anything that we had to deal with. Then in here, I had a 1200D and then also a Nova kind of stacked on each other. One was on the floor, one was on a stand. So this is the P600, and then this is the 1200. So you can see that these lights are drawing a lot of power. And then before I even get into what we ran into, especially it was a big problem with this set, is the other lights that we had in play. So we also had a 600D and then a Forza 500 on the side here. And these both had like Fresnels on them, so we could kind of flood them and also add more output. So this is a 600D, and then this is a Forza 500. And then this is just basically me establishing a light side and getting more detail on the track, as well as hitting our talent. So this light is coming from the front and kind of spilling over there, and then VFX cleaned this up a bunch. And then we have a lot of light sandwiching her from the side. So I just wanted to establish at least a light side and a dark side, as well as spill a bunch of light on this track so we would have some detail. So when we turned all these lights on, everything was looking good. And then we had the 1200D and a P600 just to give us an even spread. And these were both around sitting at 50%, and this was sitting around 50% as well. And then the 600D as well as the Forza, these were sitting at 100% just to give me levels. And this looked extremely dark, shooting at 300 frames per second. But I knew that the colors we're working with and also the VFX team could pull a lot out of this. So my main concern was that we had this white door that was completely blown out. And then we had a bunch of detail on our talent, and then basically the information on the track. Anything else in the room or anything else that was there, I know that we could get rid of a lot of that in post. So that was the intention. And that's also me understanding and coming from a VFX and editing background that none of the background stuff matters because it's going to be taken out anyway. But if I was just approaching this as a cinematographer and didn't have any concept, any understanding of the concept, I would be in a lot of trouble, just panicking, and basically everything would go sideways because I didn't understand what the shot was supposed to look like in post. So yes, we do have a lot of lights in play here, but the next thing I want to show you is I'm just going to kind of draw this in another color, is that we actually had a dolly move in here. And obviously shooting at 300 frames per second, it's very subtle. So you have to basically move the dolly very quickly as she's sprinting. And we had initially her running by the camera. And we didn't really have the time set up or anything else to really have an overhead dolly with a T-bar system just to get the shot, because we had limited amount of crew, we had limited amount of stands, and I had to pull this off quick and dirty. So what we had is a Dana dolly system, and these were 6-foot tracks, and these were just on regular Matthew slider stands, and then the dolly was in the middle. And I have an attachment that goes onto the top of this that acts as just pipe clamps, and then I can basically sling the dolly out to the side, and then I have my camera just sitting here. And this gets basically everything out of the way, especially in the later part of the track, so we don't even see the stands in play. But the problem with this is that you need a lot of counterweight here. So we had some sandbags, and then we had a little tool bag that we used to put this together. And then in that tool bag, luckily there was weights around the track because it's also a fitness facility. And we put a bunch of dumbbell plates in there too. So that really worked for us in having this counteract. So these were 6-foot pipes, and then these were 6-foot pipes as well. So it was also limiting everything that I could put in my car because this is a very skeleton crew. And then I needed a compact dolly system that I could do that. And then the main thing is that 6-foot pipes fit in my car specifically, as well as I don't have a lot of room, or we didn't have a lot of time to set up a whole T-bar setup, as well as get that super low to the ground. So this was like my interim solution that I cobbled and fabricated together from the parts that we have here. So this was our dolly setup that allowed us get super close to the ground so we could see all this detail and make the movement and everything just feel much more grand than what it was. And then a big tip, like I said before, when it comes to slow motion, is don't do your motions when it comes to camera movement super slow like you regularly would. You have to do them super fast so you get that effect of moving with the talent. And that's something that we kind of messed up with, is because I just operated the dolly at a normal speed. I didn't realize that I needed to get this going really fast. So this was the first shot that we did, and then the next shot that we're going to move on is the tights of this. Now this is the second shot that you see in the sequence of this big impact on the shoe. In the actual commercial and the footage we use, we have her coming in running at real time, and then when it impacts on the ground, we have that in super slow motion, and then we're using the same camera settings that we had before. But I swapped my lens in this case to an 18mm that we had this, I believe, on a 35mm, shooting at 1.3 to give us as much to work with when it came to the amount of light. So in this case here, in this second setup, this was setup number 1. And then we have her running here, and then now we kind of put the camera here, and then this is our setup number 2. So we're super far away from this light, so not a lot of it is affecting the shoe. it's a bunch of this light. So we just had to run a couple of times and then did playback. So we made sure that we were sharp on the shoe specifically because we were very wide open on this. But this was just us positioning ourselves in the lights that were already there and getting this detail shot in a matter of 5 minutes, just resetting everything. And all this light that is coming from is the 600D as well as the Forza 500. And it's giving us a very heavy contrast ratio, which we're looking for this in this entire commercial. So we have the light nicely falling off into black here, as well as getting super dark down here. And then we're getting a lot of natural neg just in terms of how we lit this, as well as the track acting that as well. When you get into contrast ratios and asking yourself, what is this supposed to feel like? I kind of go back based off of the first wide that we did. This is supposed to be a black empty void. So I'm not gonna have a lot of lifted shadows when it comes to the detail. Even though this is a product shot of the shoe and you're supposed to look at all nice and everything, we kind of took this in terms of our own creative input. And yes, we could have asked the colorist to lift everything, but we really like the rawness, the dirtiness, and the contrast that came with this. And that's honestly the balance when it comes to shooting commercials and then just deciding and going with a contrast ratio. If I kind of did this a little bit more lifted, it really wouldn't play back to back when you're trying to put these shots together. Because when I kind of toggle these on and off, there is continuity, especially when it comes to lighting and lighting direction. And that's the most important thing. And the last shot that we're going to look at from this sequence is one of the best shots of the piece that we were super surprised with. And the reason that I'm so surprised with this shot is because we shot this on the Sony FX3 at 1080p. And this was at 240 frames per second. So this is like the max resolution that you can get out of this camera at this frame rate specifically. So we actually had the Ember set up on an 18mm and we're about to shoot the shot. But as we were setting up for the shot, we heard some pops and we blew some fuses that were on the property. And then trying to repatch all our cables, but then found out there was a bunch of fuses already blown on the property. So we had to act really quickly on our feet, and Jason and I kind of looked at each other and said, we need to shoot this on an FX3, and this is just because of the base ISO. So we shot this at 12,800 ISO, and then just so we could get enough information. Basically, I was only working with a P600 at this point. The 1200 was completely gone and we couldn't really find another plug for it. And then we dialed that down to 20%. And all the lights that we had on the back, we dialed them down to another 50%. Because we just didn't want to risk of having no light at all. So it was us analyzing the situation, and then I didn't want to scrap the shot completely because it's one of the most important shots of the piece of her actually reaching the door, and then the title card going on with the logo. So I looked at the BTS operator at that point, I grabbed his camera, and then luckily we had adapters on us too. We didn't have anything to rig it out, so there wasn't even a feed going to Jason. And the lens that we shot this on was a 12mm Laura, and this was at T2.1. So this just gave me enough information to work with, and it was super noisy obviously when we shot it, when it came to all the detail in the background, but I was more focused on what was necessarily in the center. And this was more so the light coming from this, as long as it was blown out and just giving enough information on the ground, and the lighting our main talent running to this door and how that looked as she approached it. So this was just something that we had to act quickly on our feet, and I'm so glad that we had the Sony FX3 because we wouldn't have got the shot, and I don't think we'd be able to save this in post. There's a lot done in terms of just taking out the background and then just isolating the talent by our VFX team. And this is why the Sony FX3 is one of my favorite cameras, is because of how versatile it is. The frame rates that you get out of it, the actual color information that you get out of it. The only my complaint is that it's a tad bit noisy, even when exposing properly. And that's just something that you have to work with, but it can be completely taken out in post. When it comes to deciding to use slow motion, this is a big conversation that you have to have with yourself if you're the director and cinematographer, or the person that you're working with, of what these big moments are supposed to feel in the piece. What big emotions, what do you want the viewer to stop and be like, feel like almost time is stopped? And when it comes to a technical aspect, it's beyond emotions, it's what you see in frame. And then this scene is a very good example of that, is that we have all these tiny little particles that you wouldn't be able to see if we just shot this at 24 frames per second or just look funny. This was a big moment where she's feeling a bunch of emotions, And then we emphasized with all these particles falling, and this was just ground up styrofoam board that we used. And then we shot this in slow motion to make it feel very dramatic. So this was shot on the Ember, and then we're using the 35mm here, and this is at T1.3. just to give us as much light as possible. We're at the base ISO of this camera, which is unfortunately 500 ISO. And we shot this at 300 FPS with a 180-degree shutter. I always didn't change my shutter, even in situations where I'm like, I could use a little bit more light. I kept it standard at that because if I knew if I decrease it, it's kind of like cheating and the motion blur wouldn't be right. So I never touched the actual shutter angle, or I never touched the ISO. It was just the frame rate that I was choosing and then supplementing that with light. So we have a lot going on here, but when it came to the lighting, it was pretty simple, but there was this little trick I used to actually emphasize the particles that were falling. So we have a big key light here, which is an 8x8 frame. And then this is just an art silk stretched over that. And this was the same artificial silk that I used for the track. So I would just recommend, if you're starting out and getting into silks, artificial silk is your go-to. And when it comes to bouncing, unbleached muslin is one of my favorite things to use. So we have the artificial silk here, and then we just have the Nova P600C. And my white balance for the camera was sitting at 4400 Kelvin. And this was constant throughout the entire commercial when we were swapping even to the FX3 as well, shooting a lot of scenes on the Venice. And I love to shoot my commercials like this because it turns daylight into this nice kind of blue color. And I like to push a lot of blue into my shadows when it comes to my work, especially when it comes to shooting commercials that are supposed to feel like this as well. So we have that Nova P600 sitting here, and this was sitting at 50%. And then this is kind of wrapping around our talent and acting as our main key light here. So this is wrapping around the entire face, and it's just giving us a very pleasing contrast ratio, and it gets very heavy over here. But another thing that we did is we were working in a studio that we had access to an overhead truss, but you could easily achieve this with a black backdrop. So we just had a 12x12 duvetine. So this is just duve, and this was just hanging overhead and acting as a black backdrop. And we had this distance off enough that you didn't see any of the detail, and duvetine sucks up a bunch of light. So we're completely fine with that. And then the additional light that we used was actually a 600C Pro here. So this was a 600C, and then this light is just sitting here. And this has a Fresnel on it, so we can get a little bit more spread. And this was sitting around 50% as well. But this was set to 5600 Kelvin. I didn't want to mix any color temperatures here, and I felt that this was right for this scene too. So the 600C is hitting the side of her head here and acting as a harsh edge light and hair light. But you can see that it's only coming down to basically here and then highlighting the edge of her neck. But if we look at this light and adding a Fresnel to that, the spread is massive, and we're only hitting her with maybe 10% of that spread. The rest of the spread is going towards these particles and lighting that. I knew that the levels from the P600 and basically stopping that down with the artificial silk would be kind of enough to see them, but I wanted them very visible, and then I wanted a lot of light hitting them. So basically we have all those particles falling above her and behind her here, and that is where our main focus of light is hitting. So it's just emphasizing the particles falling and just adding a bunch of levels, because I knew that they were going to be white. So I just know that I needed to hit them with a bunch of light, but not necessarily blasting her with the edge of that light. So only 10% of that light is hitting her, and 90% is more focused on the particles going through the background. So as a cinematographer or director, when you're making your project, you want to have confidence going into your scenes and saying like, yes, I want this shot in slow motion. And this is something that I've developed with experience, as well as just gaining more confidence in what I'm doing. And the main question that I ask myself is, do I want this slowed down in post? Is this a moment that I want the viewer to feel something and really want the viewer to go through what the talent is going through? This is just an important question that you should start asking yourself, and ask yourself before you even get on the shoot. You don't want to be in the middle of a scene or like, do I want to slow this down? This is something that is already pre-planned and already flushed out in the pre-production process. So once you start asking yourself questions before the project is even shot, you'll end up with a lot more success when you actually step on set.